The audience was laughing. The cameras were rolling. The orchestra was playing softly. And Marilyn Monroe was smiling. But behind that smile was a woman who was terrified of one thing more than anything else. Not failure. Not rejection. Not even being forgotten. She was afraid that the world would keep staring at her, without ever seeing her. That night, she walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, expecting another television appearance. A few jokes. A few questions. A little laughter. Then she would leave. At least that was the plan. Because nobody in that studio knew that Marilyn was about to come face to face with another woman who understood the price of being beautiful. Jayne Mansfield, Hollywood's blonde sensation. The woman magazines constantly compared to Marilyn. The woman the newspapers described as the next blonde queen. For years, Hollywood had turned their careers into a competition. Marilyn versus Jayne. The original versus the newcomer. The star versus the replacement. But that night, something happened that Hollywood could never manufacture. The two women looked at each other. And instead of seeing competition, they saw themselves. The studio lights were almost painfully bright. Marilyn waited behind the curtain. She could hear the audience laughing at Johnny Carson's jokes. Every laugh sounded distant. She took a slow breath. Then another. The stage manager gave her the signal. Marilyn stepped forward. The curtain opened. The audience erupted. Applause filled the room. For a moment, Marilyn Monroe belonged completely to them. She smiled. She waved. She laughed. The woman America knew had arrived. Johnny Carson greeted her warmly. He knew how to handle celebrities. He could make nervous guests relax. He could turn awkward moments into comedy. And with Marilyn, he knew exactly what the audience wanted. Charm, beauty, humor, the famous smile. Marilyn gave them all of it. But the cameras couldn't hide her eyes. There was something fragile behind them. Something tired. Something the audience couldn't quite understand. Johnny began asking questions. Marilyn answered. The crowd laughed. Everything seemed normal. Until Johnny suddenly looked toward the entrance. And tonight, he said, we have another special guest. Marilyn's smile remained frozen for half a second. Then her eyes moved toward the door. The audience became excited. Jayne Mansfield walked onto the stage. The room exploded. Jayne smiled confidently. She knew how to command attention. She knew what people saw when they looked at her. Blonde hair, beauty, confidence, Hollywood glamour. She had been trained by the same machine that had created Marilyn. And now that machine had placed them on the same stage. For one brief moment, Marilyn and Jayne looked directly at each other. Neither woman spoke. The audience didn't notice the silence. But the cameras did. And Marilyn did. Jayne did too. Johnny smiled. Well, he looked from one woman to the other. This should be interesting. The audience laughed. Jayne laughed. Marilyn laughed softly. But underneath, the laughter was something nobody could hear. A question. What does she really think of me? Hollywood had already answered that question for them. The magazines had spent years doing it. They compared their faces, their voices, their clothes, their movies, their popularity, their bodies, their careers. Every photograph became a competition. Every new role became a challenge. Every headline created another reason for fans to choose sides. Marilyn knew how cruel that world could be. She had lived inside it for years. And now Jayne was walking into the same trap. Johnny brought up the comparisons. Jayne, people seem to compare you to Marilyn quite a lot. Jayne smiled. She could have made a joke. She could have said something provocative. That would have given the newspapers exactly what they wanted. Instead, she looked toward Marilyn. Then she answered, "There's only one Marilyn Monroe." The room became quiet. Marilyn looked at Jayne. For a moment, her expression changed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice. But there was warmth in her eyes. "I think Jayne is beautiful," Marilyn said. The audience applauded. Johnny smiled. Jayne smiled. But for Marilyn, the moment meant more than a compliment, because she knew what it felt like to be reduced to a face, to a body, to a photograph, to a name on a magazine cover. She knew what it felt like when millions of people believed they owned a piece of you simply because they had seen you on a screen. And perhaps Jayne knew it too. The conversation continued. The audience laughed. Johnny made jokes. Jayne answered confidently. Marilyn played along. But eventually, Johnny asked a different kind of question. A question that wasn't really about movies, or fame, or beauty. What is the hardest part about being famous? The audience waited for Marilyn's answer. Most people expected a joke. Maybe she would say the photographers. Maybe the press. Maybe the endless attention. Instead, Marilyn became quiet. She lowered her eyes. The room slowly followed her into silence. "The hardest part," she paused, "is that people think they know you." Nobody laughed. Johnny's expression changed. Marilyn continued. "They see the pictures." A pause. "They see the movies." Another pause. "They see the dresses." She looked toward the audience. "But they don't see the person." Silence. For a few seconds, Marilyn Monroe was no longer performing. She wasn't selling a movie. She wasn't promoting herself. She wasn't trying to be funny. She was simply telling the truth. Jayne looked at her. And something in Jayne's expression changed too. Because she understood. Maybe not everything, but enough. Then the cameras moved away for a commercial break. The moment the red lights disappeared, the atmosphere changed. Crew members crossed the stage. Someone adjusted a microphone. The audience began talking. Johnny spoke with a producer. Marilyn sat quietly. Her smile disappeared. She stared at the floor. Jayne noticed. She walked over. "You all right?" Marilyn looked up. She smiled automatically. "I'm fine." Jayne shook her head. "No." Marilyn's smile faded. Jayne sat beside her. For the first time that night, nobody was watching them. No cameras. No photographers. No audience. Just two women sitting in the quiet. Marilyn looked at Jayne. "You shouldn't believe everything you see." Jayne smiled. "I don't." Marilyn looked away. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Marilyn quietly said, "They want us to hate each other." Jayne nodded. "I know." "Why?" Jayne thought about it. "Because people like watching women compete." Marilyn gave a small laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh people make when someone says something painfully true. Then Marilyn whispered, "Maybe that's why they never let us become friends." Jayne looked at her. That sentence stayed between them. Neither woman knew what to say next. Because perhaps it was true. Hollywood didn't need them to be friends. Hollywood needed a story. And the story was simple. Two beautiful blondes, One throne, one winner. One woman would rise, the other would fall. The cameras came back on. The smiles returned. Marilyn became Marilyn again. Jayne became Jayne again. The audience laughed. Johnny continued the show. But something had changed. The two women no longer seemed like rivals. They looked like survivors of the same machine. And when the final segment arrived, Johnny thanked them both. The audience stood. Applause filled the studio. Marilyn stood beside Jayne. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Marilyn reached out. Jayne took her hand. It lasted only a few seconds. But the cameras caught it. Two women holding hands. Not competitors. Not enemies. Just two human beings. Then the curtain began to close. The audience continued applauding. The lights became softer. The stage disappeared behind the curtain. And just like that, the television audience saw the last image of Marilyn and Jayne together. But outside the studio, another story was already being created. Reporters were waiting. Photographers were waiting. The newspapers were waiting. They wanted controversy. They wanted jealousy. They wanted headlines. Marilyn's, Jayne. Who is Hollywood's true blonde queen? They were ready to turn a few minutes of television into another battle. But they had missed the real story. The real story happened when the cameras were off. The real story was the quiet conversation. The look between them. The hand they held. The understanding that neither woman had to explain. Marilyn left the studio that night surrounded by people. Assistants. Reporters. Photographers. Fans. Everyone wanted something from her. A photograph. A quote. A smile. A piece of Marilyn Monroe. She gave them the smile. She waved. She walked toward the waiting car. But when the door closed behind her, the smile disappeared. For a moment she sat alone. The city lights moved across the window. She stared outside. Maybe she was thinking about Jayne. Maybe she was thinking about the interview. Maybe she was thinking about the strange loneliness of being famous. Because there was a cruel irony in Marilyn's life. The entire world wanted to be close to her. Yet very few people truly knew her. Millions knew her face. Millions knew her name. Millions knew the sound of her voice. But who knew what happened when the lights went out? Who knew what she was afraid of? Who knew how exhausted she was? Who knew what she really wanted? And perhaps the most frightening question of all, who would still be there when the cameras disappeared? Jayne was leaving too. She sat in her own car. The streets outside were alive. But she wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about Marilyn's words. They don't see the person. Jayne understood that sentence more than she wanted to admit. Because the same thing was beginning to happen to her. The world had already decided who Jayne Mansfield was. A blonde. A bombshell. A sensation. But behind that image was another woman. A woman who wanted to be taken seriously. A woman who wanted respect. A woman who didn't want to spend the rest of her life being compared to someone else. And perhaps that was why the connection between them felt so strange. They were supposedly competitors. Yet they understood each other better than most people around them. That night ended quietly. No fight. No scandal. No dramatic confrontation. Just two women walking away from the same television stage. But history would remember Marilyn. And history would remember Jayne. And eventually, the story would become much darker. because Hollywood had a habit of doing something terrible to the women it turned into icons. It made them unforgettable, while forgetting they were human. And Marilyn Monroe was about to discover just how dangerous that could be. The television cameras had stopped. The audience had gone home. The applause had faded. But the pressure surrounding Marilyn was only getting heavier. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, another chapter was waiting. A chapter involving fame, loneliness, fear, and a woman who had spent her entire life trying to convince the world that behind the famous blonde image, there was a real person. And when that person finally began to disappear behind the image, Hollywood would realize too late what it had created. Because the night Marilyn Monroe met Jayne Mansfield wasn't really about two blondes competing for a crown. It was about two women discovering that the crown itself might be a prison. And Marilyn was already inside it. The applause was gone. The cameras were off. But Marilyn Monroe could still feel thousands of eyes following her. That was the strange thing about fame. You could leave the stage, but the stage never really left you. The next morning, newspapers were already talking. Photographs of Marilyn, photographs of Jayne, headlines about beauty, headlines about rivalry, headlines about who was winning Hollywood's attention. The story the public wanted was simple. Two blondes, one throne. But Marilyn knew the truth. There had never been a throne. There was only a cage. And every time the world applauded, the bars seemed to become stronger. Marilyn woke late. The room was quiet. Sunlight entered through the curtains. For a moment she didn't move. She stared at the ceiling. The night before kept replaying in her mind. Jayne's voice. The conversation backstage. The words. They don't see the person. Marilyn closed her eyes. She knew exactly what Jayne meant. For years, Marilyn had been surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Studios wanted movies. Photographers wanted pictures. Reporters wanted stories. Fans wanted the woman they had created in their imagination. But Marilyn wanted something much simpler. She wanted someone to look at her and not expect anything. She wanted to be able to sit quietly without performing, to laugh without pretending, to cry without being embarrassed, to exist without being watched. But Hollywood didn't work that way. Hollywood had created Marilyn Monroe. And Hollywood wanted Marilyn Monroe every second of the day. Across town, Jayne Mansfield was facing the same machine. Her name was everywhere. Her photographs filled magazines. People compared her to Marilyn. Some called her the new blonde sensation. Others said she was trying to copy Marilyn. Jayne hated the comparison. Not because she disliked Marilyn. Quite the opposite. She respected her. That was the problem. The more Jayne was compared to Marilyn, the less people seemed interested in Jayne herself. She wasn't allowed to simply be Jayne Mansfield. She had become a question. Could she replace Marilyn? But nobody could replace Marilyn. And Jayne knew it. Days passed. The television appearance became another Hollywood story. The moment between Marilyn and Jayne was remembered by some, forgotten by others. But Marilyn didn't forget it. She remembered Jayne's hand. She remembered the silence. Most of all, she remembered the strange comfort of being understood without having to explain herself. That feeling was rare, almost impossible, and Marilyn needed it more than she admitted. One evening, Marilyn sat alone in a quiet room. A photograph was lying on the table. She picked it up. It was a photograph of herself smiling. the famous Marilyn smile. Perfect, beautiful, untouchable. She stared at it. Then she whispered, "Who is she?" The question hung in the room. She knew the woman in the photograph. Everyone knew her. But Marilyn wondered if anyone knew the woman holding the photograph. She put it down. Then the phone rang. Marilyn looked at it. She hesitated. Finally she answered. Another request. Another appearance. Another interview. Another opportunity to become the person everyone expected. She agreed. She always did. Because saying no in Hollywood had consequences. And Marilyn had already learned how quickly the industry could turn against someone. Meanwhile, Jayne's career was accelerating. She was becoming more famous, more visible, more desirable to studios. And with every success came another comparison. Marilyn, Marilyn, Marilyn. Jayne couldn't escape the name. But she refused to hate her for it. Instead, she began to understand something. The woman everyone called her rival might actually be the only person who understood what she was going through. Then something unexpected happened. Jayne reached out. Not publicly. Not for publicity. Not for the newspapers. Privately. She wanted to see Marilyn again. No cameras. No reporters. No stage. Just the two of them. Marilyn agreed. They met quietly. There was no audience. No applause. No famous introductions. Just two women sitting together. Jayne looked at Marilyn. "You looked tired that night." Marilyn smiled. "I was. You still are." Marilyn laughed softly. "You noticed too much." Jayne smiled. "Maybe nobody else notices enough." Marilyn looked at her. That sentence hit harder than Jayne expected. Because Marilyn had spent years surrounded by people. Yet she often felt completely alone. She looked down. "Do you ever feel like people only want the person they think you are?" Jayne answered immediately. "All the time." Marilyn smiled. For a few moments, neither woman spoke. Then Jayne said, "Maybe we should stop letting them decide who we are." Marilyn looked up. "Maybe." It sounded like a simple conversation. But for Marilyn, it meant something. Someone had finally said it aloud. Their friendship, however brief or complicated, existed outside Hollywood's rules. They didn't need to compete. They didn't need to prove anything. They could talk. They could laugh. They could be quiet. And for Marilyn, quiet moments were becoming precious. Because the world was getting louder. Her fame was growing. The pressure was increasing. And the woman behind the image was struggling to breathe. Then came another public appearance. The lights. The cameras. The questions. Marilyn walked onto the stage. The audience applauded. But this time she looked different. Not physically. Emotionally. She seemed distant. The host asked about her career. She answered. He asked about fame. She smiled. He asked about being compared to other actresses. She laughed. But inside, something was breaking. The audience saw Marilyn Monroe. The woman on stage saw a version of herself she barely recognized. She finished the interview. The audience applauded. She walked backstage. And the moment she was alone, her expression collapsed. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I just want to be normal." Nobody heard her. Nobody except the empty hallway. That was the cruelest part. The world thought Marilyn had everything. Money, fame, beauty, success, millions of fans. But none of those things could guarantee peace. And the more famous she became, the more difficult peace became. Her image had become larger than her life. Marilyn could no longer control it. Everyone had an opinion about her. Everyone wanted to define her. And whenever she tried to become something more serious, the world pushed her back toward the blonde image it had created. She wasn't allowed to change. She wasn't allowed to age. She wasn't allowed to fail. She wasn't even allowed to be sad. Because Marilyn Monroe was supposed to smile. Always. Jayne was beginning to understand the same rule. She had watched what fame was doing to Marilyn. Now she could feel it happening to herself. The photographers wanted the same poses. The magazines wanted the same image. The public wanted the same fantasy. And Jayne began wondering, if I stop being the woman they want, will they stop loving me? That question frightened her, because it was the question Marilyn had been living with for years. One night the two women spoke again. Jayne asked, "Do you ever think about leaving Hollywood?" Marilyn became quiet. "Yes." Jayne looked surprised. "Really?" Marilyn nodded. "Sometimes I dream about disappearing." "Where would you go?" Marilyn smiled. "Somewhere nobody knows my name." Jayne looked at her. "And what would you do?" Marilyn thought for a moment. "I don't know." Then she laughed. "Maybe that's the point." They both laughed. But the laughter didn't last. Because both women knew how impossible that dream was. Once the world knew your face, you could never completely disappear. The months moved forward. Careers changed. Hollywood moved on. New stars appeared. New headlines replaced old ones. But Marilyn's struggle continued. The woman behind the image was becoming harder to reach. And Jayne could see it. She could see the exhaustion, the loneliness, the pressure, the constant need to perform. And perhaps somewhere inside, she understood something terrifying. Being Marilyn Monroe wasn't a dream. It was a responsibility. A responsibility so heavy that it could crush the person carrying it. One evening, Marilyn stood in front of a mirror. She looked at herself. The blonde hair, the makeup, the famous face. She touched the glass. Then she whispered, "Do you know who I am?" The reflection said nothing. Marilyn smiled sadly. "Neither do they." She walked away. The room became silent. And for the first time, the famous image in the mirror looked almost like a stranger. But the story between Marilyn and Jayne wasn't over. Far from it. Because while Hollywood continued to sell the idea that they were rivals, something much more complicated was happening behind the scenes. One woman was becoming more famous. The other was becoming more vulnerable. And both were discovering the same terrible truth. The world can love an image without loving the person who lives inside it. And that truth would eventually change everything. Because the next time Marilyn and Jayne's paths crossed, the conversation would no longer be about beauty. It would no longer be about competition. It would be about survival. And Marilyn would say something that Jayne would never forget. Something that would make Jayne realize just how deeply Marilyn was struggling. Something that would make the cheerful laughter of their earlier television appearance feel like a lifetime ago. Because the woman who once walked onto a stage smiling was slowly running out of strength to keep pretending. And the darkest chapter was getting closer. The world remembered Marilyn Monroe for her smile. But Jayne Mansfield remembered something else. She remembered the silence behind it, the quiet moments, the tired eyes, the woman who could make an entire room laugh and still look completely alone when the cameras stopped. That was the Marilyn Jayne remembered. Not the photograph, not the blonde bombshell, not the woman Hollywood had turned into an icon. The person. And perhaps that was why their story mattered. Because Hollywood had spent years telling the world that Marilyn and Jayne were competitors. But the truth was much simpler. They were two women trapped inside the same impossible expectation. Be beautiful. Be desirable. Be entertaining. Never change. Never age. Never break. And above all, never let the audience see you hurting. Marilyn continued working. The cameras kept rolling. The photographers kept calling. The crowds kept applauding. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But inside, Marilyn was fighting a battle nobody could see. Every appearance required energy. Every interview required a smile. Every photograph required a pose. Every public moment required her to become Marilyn Monroe. And sometimes, she simply wanted to be herself. Whoever that was. Jayne watched from a distance. She was building her own career. Her name was becoming bigger. Her face was appearing everywhere. But success came with a price. The comparisons continued. Every new photograph brought another headline. Every new role brought another question. Is Jayne Mansfield the new Marilyn Monroe? Jayne hated the question. Not because she hated Marilyn. Because she didn't want to spend her entire life being somebody's replacement. She wanted her own name, her own identity, her own story. And perhaps that was the greatest thing Marilyn had unknowingly given her. A warning. One day, Jayne thought back to their conversation. Maybe we should stop letting them decide who we are. Those words stayed with her. Because Hollywood had a strange power. It could tell a woman who she was. Until she began believing it herself. Marilyn had spent years fighting against that. Jayne was beginning to understand the battle. Then came the moment that would define Marilyn's legacy. Not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't. She was vulnerable, complicated, ambitious, funny, afraid, human, and that humanity was something Hollywood could never completely control. People wanted Marilyn to remain frozen in time. The perfect blonde, the perfect smile, the perfect fantasy. But Marilyn wanted more. She wanted to be taken seriously. She wanted to be respected. She wanted to prove that she was more than the image people had created. And every time she fought for that right, she revealed another piece of the real woman. Years later, when people looked back at photographs of Marilyn and Jayne, they saw something different. They saw two glamorous women, two stars, two blondes from another era. But if you looked closer, there was something almost heartbreaking about those photographs. Because neither woman knew exactly how history would remember them. They were simply living, working, laughing, trying to survive Hollywood, trying to build lives outside the photographs, trying to remain human in an industry that preferred them as images. Marilyn's life became increasingly complicated. The pressures grew. The expectations became heavier. And the gap between Marilyn Monroe and the woman Norma Jean had once been became harder to cross. That distinction mattered because Marilyn Monroe was a creation, a name, a persona, a dream. But Norma Jean was a human being. And somewhere between the two, a woman was trying to find herself, Jayne never became Marilyn, and that was never supposed to happen. She became Jayne, but Hollywood never completely stopped comparing them. Their names remained connected in the public imagination. Two blondes, two stars, two women who had been placed inside the same impossible story. But perhaps the real tragedy was that the world kept asking which woman was better, when the question should have been, why did either woman have to compete at all? Marilyn's story eventually became bigger than Hollywood. Her image survived generations. Her photographs survived. Her movies survived. Her voice survived. Her name survived. But what survived most powerfully was the contradiction. The world saw a woman who appeared to have everything. Yet behind the famous image was someone who wanted what fame could never give her. Peace, privacy, understanding, a chance to exist without performing. And that is why the memory of Marilyn remains so powerful. Not because she was flawless, because she wasn't. She was human. And Jayne Mansfield's story carried its own tragedy. She too became part of Hollywood's obsession with beauty and celebrity. She too learned how quickly fame could turn a person into an image. She too discovered that the public could love the fantasy. Without knowing the woman, their lives took different paths. But the lesson remained the same. Fame can make you unforgettable. It can put your face on millions of screens. It can make strangers believe they know you. But fame cannot promise happiness, and applause cannot heal loneliness. Think back to that television stage. The lights, the laughter, Johnny Carson smiling, Marilyn sitting beneath the cameras, Jayne beside her, the audience watching. Everyone believed they were witnessing entertainment. But beneath the laughter was something deeper. Two women looking at each other and understanding something the audience couldn't see. They weren't enemies. They weren't trying to destroy each other. They were simply two women trying to survive the expectations placed upon them. And perhaps the most beautiful part of the story is that for a brief moment, they didn't have to pretend. Imagine that stage after everyone had left. The chairs were empty. The lights were dim. The cameras were silent. The applause was gone. No one was asking Marilyn to smile. No one was asking Jayne to be glamorous. No one was comparing them. For a few minutes, they were finally free of the world. And that is the image worth remembering. Not Marilyn the icon, not Jayne the bombshell, but two human beings standing beneath fading studio lights, finally seen without the masks. Marilyn once became one of the most recognizable women in history. And perhaps that is the cruelest irony of all. The world never stopped looking at her. Yet the person behind the image was often the hardest thing for people to see. That is why her story still hurts. Because somewhere behind the famous smile was a woman asking a question that fame could never answer. Will anyone ever love me for who I really am? And maybe Jayne understood that question too. Maybe that's why their brief connection remains so fascinating. Because Hollywood wanted a rivalry. But what it created instead was recognition. One woman saw another woman struggling under the same weight. And for a moment, there was no competition, no crown, no winner, no loser, just understanding. The years passed. The photographs became history. The television shows became memories. The headlines became old newspaper clippings. But Marilyn's face never disappeared. It remained. On posters, on magazine covers, on screens, in photographs. Generation after generation continued to look at her. And perhaps the world will always be fascinated by Marilyn Monroe for one simple reason. Everyone thinks they know her, but they don't. They know the image. They know the smile. They know the blonde hair. They know the famous photographs. But the real woman was always more complicated, more vulnerable, more ambitious, more human. And that is the part of her story that should never be forgotten. Because Marilyn Monroe wasn't simply a Hollywood star. She was a woman trying to escape the character the world had created for her. And Jayne Mansfield wasn't simply her rival. She was another woman walking through the same dangerous world, trying to create an identity of her own. Hollywood told them to compete. History remembers them together. And maybe that is the greatest twist of all. The two women who were supposed to fight for the same crown ended up revealing the same truth. There was never really a crown. There was only a spotlight. And the spotlight was never as beautiful as it looked. Because when the lights became too bright, you could no longer see the person standing underneath them. So when you see Marilyn Monroe smiling in an old photograph, look again. Don't just see the icon. Don't just see the blonde hair. Don't just see the Hollywood legend. Look at her eyes. Because sometimes, the eyes tell the story the smile was never allowed to tell. And somewhere beside that memory stands another blonde woman. Jayne Mansfield. The supposed rival. The supposed replacement. The supposed competitor. But perhaps she was something else. Perhaps for a brief moment, she was simply someone who looked at Marilyn and saw a human being. And maybe that is why their story deserves to be remembered. Not as a battle between two beautiful women, but as a reminder that behind every famous face, there is a person. Behind every smile, there can be pain. Behind every applause, there can be silence. And behind every legend, there was once a human being simply trying to be understood. The cameras eventually stopped. The lights eventually faded. The applause eventually disappeared. But Marilyn Monroe remained. Not because the world finally understood her, but because it never stopped trying. And perhaps that is the tragedy and the beauty of Marilyn Monroe. The world wanted the legend, but the woman only wanted to be seen.